Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. We have a very large group of people joining us online and a more intimate group joining us in person. This evening, we welcome Jacqueline Jones. Dr. Jones was the L&C Temple Chair of Women's History and the Maston Gentry White Professor of Southern History at the University of Texas at Austin, where she taught courses focused on the history of African Americans, labor, women, family, and the South. She is a Bancroft Prize winner, a MacArthur Fellow, and has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She is a graduate of the University of Delaware and University of Wisconsin-Madison. This evening, she'll discuss her most recent book, No Right to an Honest Living, The Struggles of Boston's Black Workers in the Civil War Era, which highlights the injustice Black Bostonians encountered in the workforce and how Black entrepreneurs forged alternative career paths. For anyone who is new to the Massachusetts Historical Society, we have been collecting and preserving history for the past 232 years. We are the first historical society in America. We maintain a research library with an amazing collection of materials. We have close to 14 million manuscript pages in our collection. We make this collection available to the public for free, as well as hosting a wide variety of programs and seminars for public and academic audiences. We're only able to host programs like this thanks to our members and donors. So we hope you enjoy our programs. We hope you'll come back to additional programs, and we hope that you'll support the work of MHS by becoming a member or a donor. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Gavin, for that nice introduction, and welcome to all of you here and to those of you in Zoomlandia. I'm very happy to be here tonight. You know, I've used the Historical Society's collections for several of my books, and I especially appreciated the images that I used for this one. I just want to say, you know, just the other day I was reading a quote from Jeremy Belknap, and in 1787, this Boston-born clergyman and historian was complaining that the 7-year-old American Academy of Arts and Sciences showed no interest in preserving what he called, quote, a collection of dead materials for the use of the future historian. Now, I was struck by the use of the term dead materials because these are materials that obviously speak to us now. Parenthetically, Belknap, of course, went on to found the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1791. But I do want to get back to this idea of dead materials and draw your attention to the quotation here from Dr. John S. Rock, who gave a speech in Boston, March of 1860, the 90th anniversary of the death of Crispus Attucks in the Boston Massacre. Dr. Rock was born in 1825 in New Jersey. He was trained as a dentist, then as a physician. He was a public lecturer and ended his career as an attorney and the first Black man to be admitted to argue before the Supreme Court of the United States. So there's a tremendously impressive historiography on the 19th century Black fight for civil rights. Those legal rights, including suffrage, intermarriage, school integration, the ability especially to serve on juries, to run for office, rights related to the integration of entertainment and transportation venues, and rights related to political engagement generally. And again, many recent historians have really done a terrific job of exploring this dramatic story of this really amazing civil rights movement in New England in general and in Boston in particular. But in many of those books, I found that there was little or nothing about Black people's struggle to make a living. Even though work was a central, everyday lived experience, Work was a major focus of Black political struggle, even though work was an issue with implications for family life and wealth accumulation, and even though work was a preoccupation of 19th century reformers, from abolitionists in the antebellum period to labor activists and academics in the progressive era. So tonight I want to elaborate on several themes and at the same time introduce you, I hope, to some really fascinating Boston workers, Black workers. So my point is that Black workers were largely confined to menial labor despite three major 19th century upheavals: the New England Industrial Revolution, the Civil War, and the emergence of the commercial retail sector. Over their lifetimes, most Black laborers contended with irregular, low-paying jobs because a whole host of potential white allies refused to press for just working conditions and opportunities for Blacks in private homes, businesses, on city public works projects, and in the US military. And yet at the same time, Black men and women showed a great deal of resilience, creativity, and resourcefulness in making a living and sustaining their families, at times in ways that were not documented in the census or other formal or official reports about the social division of labor. Now, the narrative thread of my book is shaped by the history of a group that I call the Edlow 66. This was 66 formerly enslaved people who came to Boston from Virginia in September of 1847. They had been freed by the will of their master, Carter Edlow, who died in 1844. They did not achieve their real freedom, though, until 3 years later. The leader of this group is here, Reverend Peter Randolph, often called Blacksmith Peter. And I follow his career in Boston and also that of Thomas Selden and his father, Carter Selden. So the Edlow 66 was composed of interlocking network, kinship networks in all 25 men, 15 women, and 26 children. They came to Boston, as I said, September 15th, 1847, and each came with $14.96, not the $50 that had been promised them by Carter Edlow in his will. And the Reverend Peter Randolph, later in 1855, made good on Carter Edlow's promise. It's a dramatic story, in fact. Blacksmith Peter, once he came to Boston, became what was called a tender, which was kind of an all-around handy person. He was a custodian, he swept, he dusted, he washed windows, he ran errands for a series of very prominent white men. Now, when the Edlow 66 came, they were met at Long Wharf by Samuel May Jr., who was an associate of William Lloyd Garrison, and May rushed down from the Liberator offices down to the wharf to greet these newcomers. And as you can see, he says, or he predicts that they will present an opportunity for a great experiment to see if Black people can work and provide for themselves. Now, he's interesting because he says, the Edlow 66 are not fugitives. They're not freedom seekers the way Frederick Douglass, Ellen and William Craft, Harriet Jacobs, and others were. These fugitives that I've just mentioned, of course, very resourceful, very cunning in their escape from the South to the North. The Edlow 66 boarded a boat in Richmond, Virginia, and came to Boston. And he said, the Edlow 66 are more representative of the formerly enslaved. You know, they haven't shown that great cunning and genius to get here, and we'll see how they fare. Interestingly enough, May keeps in touch with Peter Randolph for the most part, but does not really do much to help place these men and women in jobs once they arrive in Boston. So, but this idea of an experiment it's a term that's used by Northern whites and also by whites in the South right after the Civil War. You know, this is a great experiment. Will these formerly enslaved people work, and under what conditions? So, as I mentioned, these freedom seekers, the Edlow 66, were different from some of these more famous fugitives. Well, just a reminder here that Boston was first and foremost a port city, and that it was a city that had a lot of Irish immigrants in the mid-19th century, and those facts are certainly going to shape the social division of labor in the city. I will just point out that most Black women worked as laundresses or servants during this period. Most Black men worked as hawkers or peddlers or porters, servants, or tenders. And most of them could only get piecemeal jobs, not stable jobs. And what many Black workers, especially the men, had to do was to go from place to place on a daily basis and look for work, inquire of a shop owner, inquire of a merchant, whether he had any jobs for them to do, short-term jobs for an hour or two, or maybe for a day or two. And this process was documented really in a very detailed way by the history of Anthony Burns, who was a fugitive from Richmond in 1854, came to Boston, and immediately began to look for work in the company of a man named William Jones. And if you read the transcript of the testimony in Anthony Burns's rendition trial of 1854, William Jones gives a really fascinating account of this odyssey that he took Anthony Burns on in going from place to place, from a hotel to a dancing master to a used clothing shop, in order to find work. So it's really fascinating to see that process described in such detail, but it was a basic experience of many Black workers, especially Black men, during this period. So if you recall that first slide, Dr. Rock said, "Faithful friends are hard to find." And what I'd like to do is look at 6 potential groups of white allies whom we might have thought had good reason to serve as advocates for Black workers in their struggle for integrated work sites, for better wages, better working conditions, more opportunities, in other words, for economic justice writ large. And I wanted to begin with the abolitionists, the white abolitionists, and certainly they were courageous physically. They were men and women, much to be admired. Boston, of course, a hub of radical abolitionism during this period. But John S. Rock and also Frederick Douglass argued that the abolitionists were more concerned with enslaved people in the South than they were with their Black neighbors in Boston. And Frederick Douglass here notes that abolitionists are not hiring Black men in their counting houses, their stores, because these men say it will hurt our business. And this was a speech that Douglass gave in Boston in 1853. So again, I think one of the major issues here is that men like Garrison, Phillips, Theodore Parker, and others said, you know, our priority is the suffering slave in the South. And all things considered, Black Bostonians are pretty fortunate to be where they are. Also, I think that Garrison was worried about alienating potential contributors to the anti-slavery cause by asking anti-slavery minded merchants and other employers to take on Black workers in their shops, their counting houses, their warehouses. So abolitionists, white abolitionists, a source of disappointment and a considerable amount of resentment here on the part of Black Bostonians. In this regard, I want to stress again the courageous work these white abolitionists did, but point out that their major focus was on the enslaved in the South. Republicans before, during, and after the war, white Republicans. I give here a picture of Lewis Hayden, himself a fugitive. He was born in Kentucky, fled, managed to come to Boston with his wife Harriet and his son. He had a used clothing store that went bankrupt in 1857, and in 1858, he was given a job as the messenger for the Massachusetts Secretary of State, a job he held until he died in 1889. But he was exceptional. He was exceptional. Republicans, white Republicans as a group did not press for integrated work sites. They did not appeal to the white laboring classes and say, these are your brothers and sisters. They're also ready and willing to take jobs. If you go on strike, it would be to your benefit if you included them in your unions, included them in your workplaces. But Republicans didn't make that case. And again, I think they were just concerned about alienating any white supporters in the laboring classes. Labor reformers and leaders. And this is Jenny Collins, who was a labor reformer in Massachusetts. I'll get to her more about her in a moment. But Boston in particular had a number of really strikingly impressive labor leaders during this period. Iris Stewart advocated for the 8-hour day. Frank Keyes Foster was a Massachusetts native, a leader of the Knights of Labor, and together with Samuel Gompers, he helped found the American Federation of Labor in 1886. So getting back to Jenny Collins, a labor reformer, she wrote about factory work and domestic service in a book called Nature's Aristocracy, A Plea for the Oppressed, 1871, in which she said there is nothing more degrading these days than to work as a domestic servant. These women, the employers, the mistresses are arrogant, they're demanding, they're penny pinchers, they're mean-spirited. She wrote a whole screed about them in Nature's Aristocracy. I will just mention too that Louisa May Alcott of Little Women fame wrote a really interesting book in 1871 called Work, A Story of Experience, where she took her heroine through various jobs and they always came up short. And one of the most awful jobs was that of domestic servant, where a strong, intelligent young woman was just put through the ringer when she wasn't putting the laundry through the ringer for these, again, arrogant women. So while these books were being written and Jenny Collins and others were arguing that, factory work was probably going to be the future of young women, and that was a problem as well. But while they were writing these books, there was a mass migration out of Virginia among refugees into Boston. And this migration consisted primarily, but not exclusively, of Black women and their children who were brought to the city to work as domestic servants. So we can see how white women begin to say, you know, there's nothing more degrading than working as a domestic. Let's leave that behind. Let's work in shops as clerks, or let's work in factories as operatives, and we'll leave the domestic service to Black women and children. This effort was sponsored by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866 to 1867. Anna Lowell, a white woman, established what she called the Howard Industrial School in Cambridge, which was really just a placement agency, an employment agency for these Black migrants. This particular register from the Freedmen's Bureau shows Eliza Meeks, who has come to Boston with her 8 children during this period. So labor leaders, reformers, really are much more concerned with the plight of the factory worker during this period. And Black workers are really not their concern at all. We find during the late antebellum period, the city of Boston using more and more workers for its construction projects, its major public works projects. And this image shows the filling in of the Back Bay around 1859, and scavengers going through the debris and the sand and the gravel that's been brought in. At the very top of the image, you can barely see it, but there's a train. You can kind of see the smoke coming out of its top. That train is bringing in carload after carload of gravel from Needham, which displaces a lot of Teamsters and other laborers. But it was a tremendously ambitious project, and it required a lot of workers. We see that during the war as well. There are a lot of construction projects during the war. Seems odd to think that, but there were a lot of immigrant longshoremen who were out of work during the war and who got jobs from the city during the conflict. That really accelerated the hiring of public works projects laborers after the Civil War, and those jobs went exclusively to white men. So many Black people were taxpayers. They didn't own their own homes, but they owned enough furniture to be able to vote if they paid the $1.50 poll tax each year. So you would think that city officials would have an incentive to appeal to this group of taxpayers and provide them with some of these public works jobs, but that was not the case. I also look, of course, at the Black soldiers in the war, especially the Massachusetts 54th, the 55th, and the Massachusetts 5th Cavalry. Those were all Black regiments. This is Dr. John V. DeGrasse. He was a surgeon, served in the Union Army. Black soldiers, of course, got lesser pay until late in the war. They got $7 a month compared to the $13 a month their white counterparts got. And after the war, I thought, well, white veterans should be embracing their Black brothers, given the role Black men played in helping to win the war for the North. But of course, white veterans segregated themselves into separate veterans organizations. And we find very little evidence of any of these veterans serving as advocates for Black workers. And finally, another group that I thought might be potential allies for Black men and women in the workplace were progressive social settlement workers and academics. I'm sorry this is a little blurry, but it is the front of a book by John Daniels published in 1914. It's called In Freedom's Birthplace, and it's a study of Black people in Boston. Most of the data is from the year 1900. We see during this period the rise of scientific racism. John Daniels noted that Black men, women, and children were in menial positions, and he queried white employers about this. And some white employers said, well, you know, we've never hired any Black people. We assumed they couldn't do the work. But then again, if they've never been hired, they've never had an opportunity to show that they could do the work, whether it was working a cash register or working a machine of some kind. But Daniels himself, he is trying to rationalize and justify a discriminatory social division of labor. He says, these are Southerners, many Black people in Boston have come from the South, they're migrants, they're rural, you know, they have to adjust to city living, but that certainly wasn't true of many immigrants who came from rural areas and jumped right into the Boston industrial sector. So what I do in the book is to look at these various potential allies. And I think that's really a critical topic, because in mid-19th century Boston, Black people represented only about 1 or 2% of the total population. So it's a very small group, and they're not going to have the political clout, even though most of them obviously are aligned with the Republican Party. They're not going to have the political clout to become the constituency of any one political party. And they need white allies to make breakthroughs in these segregated work sites throughout the city. And they literally have no allies during this period. So I want to move on a little bit and ask how a focus on work enhances our view of familiar themes of Boston's history, of Black history during this period. Well, one theme I look at is what I call the fugitive economy in Boston. Boston was a destination for many runaways, many freedom seekers from the South. Some of them stayed in the city, others moved on to Canada. But I found usually money changed hands. And to look at this kind of fugitive business was enlightening, because many of Boston's fugitives came from Virginia, and they came from either Richmond or Norfolk, and they usually had to pay a broker in one of those cities and the captain of the ship they boarded and or the crew members of the ship, so that they would not be revealed and sent back in the course of the voyage. So it's a very interesting business, getting these fugitives, for instance, out of Richmond on board and then into Boston. And these workers in the South had to have saved some money, and many, like Anthony Burns, had, because they had been hired out while they were enslaved. So I include an image of Elizabeth Blakely, who, like many of these freedom seekers, was really traumatized by the voyage north. And most of these Virginia fugitives did come aboard ship. She had to remain hidden for 4 weeks. We have accounts of these men and women kind of staggering off the ship in Boston, having endured long, cold voyages with little to eat, cramped into small places out of the sight of the white crew. Think of the plight of these men and women, and then think of Samuel May saying, well, you know, you've arrived in Boston, now find work. Now find work, without an appreciation of the real trauma suffered by these fugitives, and concern often for their loved ones left behind. Also, fugitive assistance was a way of earning money for some people. This, an account book from the Boston Vigilance Committee, and it shows, for instance, several people boarding, nursing, and providing professional services for a fugitive named Alice C. Green. There's some familiar names here: William Cooper Nell, Samuel May Jr., Lewis Hayden, serving as fugitive assistants and earning some money in the process. These assistants got paid for posting descriptions of slave catchers, providing room and board expenses, providing clothing and medical care, providing tickets to Canada. The Reverend Peter Randolph served as a fugitive assistant, and since his family was always living on the thin edge of distress, the amount he could earn this way, I think, was critical for him and his family. Also, we have to remember the significant role played by women who took care of these fugitives. Harriet Hayden, the wife of Lewis Hayden, at one time she had 13 fugitives living in her home on Southack Street. She was the one doing the laundry, doing the cooking, providing sustenance for these migrants right after they came to Boston. So this was unwaged work by and large, but it's a critical part of the fugitive economy. Another issue here, and I draw your attention again to this quote from Frederick Douglass, because when we think of his fallout from, with William Lloyd Garrison, we often think of their differences related to the meaning of the US Constitution or the viability of political action as opposed to withdrawing from politics altogether. But I would argue that another real issue separating the two men was over this issue of employment for Black workers. And Douglass was quite outspoken about this. He could afford to be because he was famous, because he had his own way of making a living. A lot of other Black leaders felt that they could not speak out in any critical way toward white abolitionists, but Douglass could, and it's an interesting element of his split, I think, with Garrison. Also, these are very famous abolitionists, Charles Lennox Remond and his sister Sarah Parker Remond. They were from Salem, Massachusetts, but actually they spent a lot of time in Boston. And what people don't often realize is that they devoted their lives, especially Charles, to the anti-slavery cause, and yet had such a hard time supporting his own family. In other words, when he went out to speak on behalf of an abolitionist organization, he got a small stipend. He didn't get a portion of the proceeds they took that night. He got a small amount and maybe his travel expenses, maybe, but sometimes he wasn't paid. And this was true after the war when he began to campaign for women's suffrage as well. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton just did not pay him for months at a time, and his family back home suffered. So this again, to look at abolitionism as a type of work, I think is one way of considering the labor of these men and women. I think too that one critical element of this story is the performative nature of white supremacy in Boston. And it was often on the streets where those performances took place. The streets of Boston had kind of a carnivalesque atmosphere during this period. You can see the organ grinder entertaining the children, the women in their finery, the carriage driver racing through the streets. There are workers on the streets. The streets are a world unto themselves. And it's the streets, of course, that are the arteries where Black men have to navigate every day to find work. So looking at the streets, the barriers of facing these job seekers is really important. From the title of the book and John Rock's John Rock's statement there, no right to an honest living, I do look at some other kinds of making a living, what I call the underground commons, which was these were multiracial work sites in Boston. This is a rat pit. And what you can't see from this image is the man, his name is Old Jum, who collected the rats. And he went around with a burlap bag to the stables in the city. A big bag of rats would fetch him $5, which was not an inconsiderable sum. So a way of making a living for Old Jum. Also, I look at a dance hall operator named Joseph Clash, who was a fascinating character. He was a barber. He operated this dance hall. He called it the American Hall. He was a musician. He was a con man. He was a pimp. He was a real all-around violent character who figured in several high-profile murder trials in Boston during this period. A fascinating person, and his American Hall was an institution in the North End, and it brought in black and white customers, men and women. There's a great article in the Boston Herald written by a journalist who was accompanied by a police officer. They went to the hall one night and they commented, you know, the food was fabulous, the music was great, the dancing was great, and Joseph Clash was really a Boston institution. And when he would come on trial for assault, he was inevitably exonerated by the jury. They would not convict him because, again, the American Hall was such a fixture in the North End. So his work, he was an employer of musicians, of prostitutes. A lot of scamming took place in the American Hall. It was a very violent area, actually. I do look at sex workers, card sharps, scam artists, pickpocketers, and pickpocket dresses. And my point here is that I think we should file these images under work and not just under crime, because these are people trying to make a living. They are trying to pay the rent by providing illicit services, engaging in illicit activities, and so forth. And there was a great deal of creativity here in this underground economy, underground commons. And one group I look at, and it's a job that only Black men and women could have, and that is of the fugitive imposter. The man or woman who presents himself or herself as a runaway in need of money to redeem his or her family in the South. And these imposters had to have a good story, they had to be brilliant storytellers, and they had to be persistent, and they had to be ready to pick up and leave the moment somebody exposed them as the frauds they were. But they're really a fascinating group of people, very, very professional in a sense, and also very skilled in what they did. And this is, you know, the Liberator would carry ads for, you know, be on the lookout for these imposters. So in the book, I also look at the struggles of high-profile, accomplished leaders. And these are men and women who had white clienteles and were able, to a certain extent, to prosper accordingly. So for a Black man or woman to have a white clientele or to be able to invest in real estate, those were kind of the main avenues of wealth accumulation and upward mobility. Joshua Bowen Smith, a caterer, Robert Morris, a famous attorney who had both Black and white clients. Louise de Morty was an elocutionist. She would declaim poetry and sections from great literature. Christiana, Madame Carteau Bannister, was a hair doctress. And these men and women were kind of the exceptions that proved the rule. Again, they were going to need white patrons or white clients in order to prosper. So a couple of other themes here. the household burdens placed on women who were married to abolitionists, activists. Anna Douglas was long suffering, of course, taking care of the homestead, the children, while her husband, her famous husband, was away for much of the time. I also look at military service as a kind of work. So if you think about it, you can evaluate military service as you would any kind of civilian job, right? You look at the pay, you look at the working conditions, you look at supervisors, bosses, whether people can become promoted or not, what their overall working condition, what their workplace culture is all about. And looking at Black servicemen during the Civil War in this way reveals that there were a lot of similarities between the military encampment, the military service, and the civilian workforce, the lesser pay, the arrogant white officers, and meanwhile, the hardship of the families left back home in Boston, the women and children who were not receiving their husbands' pay because the husbands in the 54th and 55th refused the lesser pay as a matter of principle until it was restored to white men's pay in July of 1864. And a lot of Black servicemen, of course, were instrumental in famous battles during the war, but they were also put to work as fatigue workers more often than white servicemen. And I found cases on the Sea Islands of Black soldiers having to put up the tents of white soldiers. In other words, serve white soldiers, even though they were in military uniform. It's really interesting to look at what I call the Boston diaspora. These are the Bostonians who went south after the Civil War. I include Harriet Jacobs, author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and her daughter, Louisa Jacobs, who went to Alexandria, Virginia, and then to Savannah, Georgia, to provide relief for refugees and also to teach school. And part of the impetus in going south on the part of both these women was to avoid domestic service in Boston, which they hated, and which Harriet Jacobs found was very hard on her own health. I mentioned the failure of the Republican Party. George L. Ruffin, the first Black graduate of Harvard Law School, was also the first Black judge in Boston. And he did get appointments from Republicans in the post office, the customs house, but he chafed because he did not get the opportunities, the promotions accorded his white counterparts. So again, the Republican Party after the war really not paying attention to the challenges faced by Black workers in Boston. I also wanted to mention that this study provides a kind of interesting insights into the concept of class, socioeconomic class. Leonard Grimes, one of the most distinguished leaders as a fugitive assistant, as the minister of 12th Baptist Church, really well known in the community. Here he is with his wife, Octavia Grimes. This family just barely made ends meet because the 12th Baptist Church was full of fugitives and poor people who could barely pay their preacher. So here's a man of great status and renown, and yet he is constantly worried about the economic security of his family. And I do follow a number of preachers throughout the book who face these same challenges. Also, the unusual kinds of workers. Besides the fugitive imposters, Deacon Cyrus Foster was born in Chelmsford in 1785, and he became kind of a fixture in Boston because he put on an annual concert in the city in the 1840s, 50s, and into the Civil War. And he would bring in musical acts, and he would declaim in a way that whites found amusing. And so in a way, treated him like a fool, although I wonder who was the fool, since he did become very well-to-do as a result of putting on these annual concerts, as they were called. And he would, again, charge a certain amount. He was very savvy about publicity as well. So finally, too, coping strategies among the impoverished. I looked at the role of mutual aid societies, kinship networks, church societies. Often adult children had to live in their parents' house so that they could all contribute to the household income. These were kind of the strategies used by impoverished people during this period. So let me just conclude by saying that Boston's racial division of labor in 1900 was essentially what it had been in 1850. So despite the Industrial Revolution and despite the Civil War, economic transformations after the war, Black men and women were doing essentially the same things in Boston in 1900 as they had done 50 years before. And these are categories from 1900 compiled by John Daniels. He did a survey of 4,500 Black workers in 1900, and 81% are in the menial or unskilled category. Missing here are substantial numbers of Black workers in the skilled trades, factory work, white-collar work such as bookkeeping, teaching, and other professions. And the women, of course, still mostly serving as laundresses and servants. So this is a grim story, but every once in a while, you know, I found someone whose comments really struck me, and that was the case of Charles L. Woodworth, a congregational minister in Boston, who wrote a sermon in 1867 called The Full Enfranchisement of the Negro. And as you can tell from the quotation, he says, you know, Boston, the hinterlands, the Commonwealth, the nation has profited tremendously off the backs of enslaved people. This is a debt we owe to them. We owe them something tangible after the war for their generations of unpaid labor. What can we offer to them is, and we should take this seriously, especially the way that Black soldiers were so mistreated. So, you know, here is a powerful argument for reparations. This is 1867. He doesn't go into detail about what that would look like, but again, this is a white clergyman and somebody I think quite striking. So I hope that you agree with me then that a study of the ways of making a living is a particularly rich topic for historical research, covering virtually every aspect of Black family and community life in Boston during this period. The Civil War was a traumatic event, but it did not affect the racial division of labor in Boston. The separate low-wage division of labor was not a natural historical process, but the product of decisions among many groups of ordinary white men and women in concert with employers, clergy, and political leaders. In spite of barriers to economic justice, though, Black men and women showed resilience and resourcefulness in creating their own jobs and pooling their own resources as members of extended kin groups, churches, mutual aid societies, and fraternal orders, and the Black community as a whole. So I think we should remember and honor their struggles, not only as freedom fighters, but also as workers as well. Thank you.
Do we have questions from the audience?
No, it was very interesting. My question, you mentioned though the Black population was very small here in Boston, and I know that the Great Migration sort of bypassed Boston. I think we didn't really get a lot of people till 1950 or so. Was the situation, to your knowledge, different in cities like perhaps Philadelphia or New York that had a much larger percentage of Black people?
Yes, and if you look at those cities, Leslie Harris on New York City, for instance, you'll find that Black men in New York City, for instance, were a substantial proportion of waiters in the city and were able to unionize and for some amount of period join with white waiters as well. So numbers mattered. Numbers mattered during this period. Yes, Philadelphia had a larger population of Black people as well. Those stories are somewhat different, but I would argue, you know, Boston is really interesting because of all the educational institutions in the city and because of the radical abolitionists who appeared to be very numerous, but of course were just very loud and raucous and did not really represent the majority of the city, which remained very conservative during this period.
Yes, I was wondering, what does Edlow mean? Is that a particular area?
Oh.
And then also the migration between coming up to, say, Massachusetts to Maine to Canada. Was there a bigger gap, or, you know, like, did they stay more into Canada?
So Edlow is Carter Edlow. He was a white plantation owner in Virginia, Edloe. He died in 1844. He had several children by an enslaved woman named Harriet, and in his will, he left her, it was, I don't know, a large amount, maybe $5,000, which for the time was a lot of money. She took her children and went to Philadelphia. And then she was a free person of color at that point. It's a fascinating story because Peter Randolph in 1855 sues the heirs of Carter Edlow for the money owed the Edlow 66. They came with $14.96. They should have had $50 according to the will. And he wins. Oh, it's a spoiler alert. You have to read about it. But it's really an amazing story. And he tracks down all the original migrants, all the original Edlow 66, and is able to find out where they live and what they do. So the court transcript, the proceedings are really fascinating. Catherine Clay Bazard, who was a scholar, put all this together in a book about Peter Randolph. And it's a great book. It's available in paperback, and I really relied on it. And as far as the migration, again, during the antebellum periods, mainly Virginia predominates in terms of fugitives who come to Boston, but it's hard to tell how many stay for a long period of time. And then if they don't stay, they usually go actually to Canada.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentations. Very interesting. I'm wondering how the voices of Black laborers come into play in the manuscript, and what does this period of African American labor tell us about conditions today?
So, yeah, I had to be a little creative in sources, but I found newspapers to be really wonderful sources. And of course, now that they're digitized, this is a COVID book in the sense that a lot of the materials I found online, and it's easy to plug in search terms and then just see what comes up in all these Boston newspapers of this period. So police court is really interesting for men and women who testify about their own work circumstances, court trial transcripts that are often in the newspapers, to, you know, the stuff that there were a couple of murder cases surrounding Joseph Clash's American Hall, and lots of different people testify what they were doing that night. The prostitutes sitting on windowsills, smoking, watching the crowd below. And, you know, these are very evocative descriptions. So that's certainly, you know, those are certainly significant sources that, and the Freedmen's Bureau records too provide a lot about the Howard Industrial School in Cambridgeport in the 1866, 1867. And the census, you know, I say if I ever had to be stranded on a desert island, and if there was only one website I could have with me, it would be ancestry.com, because all the census material is there. And Massachusetts had a census in 1855, as well as the federal census, decennial census in 1850 and 1860. So that's a wonderful source too. But there's really a tremendous amount on that site.
All right. To follow up, I was particularly struck by your discussion, and I think you showed a letter to Garrison about warning him about those who are imposing as fugitive slaves.
Oh, yes, right.
And one of the things I was wondering, because there's folks like William Cooper Nell who worked with the Liberator in Garrison, even though that was uncustomary at the time. And I'm wondering if there were any other sort of instances that come up in your book of these more fugitive acts in which Black people are sort of stealing jobs against the grain of custom, and what other examples may have or may not have surfaced in your book.
Right. Well, I point to the fugitive imposters as very creative types. They had to have a good narrative. They had to be brave. They had to, be self-possessed when they came up against these anti-slavery folks, Black and white, asked them for money, so forth. As far as others, most fugitives, a lot of fugitives were waiters, because employers in downtown hotels and restaurants didn't ask for any identification. They always needed wait staff. The women I follow, Rebecca Jones, came out of Richmond. She went right away to work in, I think it was the Parker House, which was a new hotel in Boston at that point. So to look at the kinds of jobs, they need to kind of keep a low profile, right? Because after 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, they're going to be surveilled, and owners are going to send slave catchers north. So there is a certain clandestine character to some of the labor, and that's why I found the underground commons so interesting. I mean, these are pickpockets and they are scammers, and if they can make a little money doing that, they will do it to pay the rent, keep their families going. So that's where the creativity comes in, I think.
We have some great comments coming in online, and Jane asks, can you comment on the impact of Prince Hall Freemasonry in enhancing the status of Boston's Black community? Joshua B. Smith, Lewis Hayden, and Reverend Leonard Grimes were all Prince Hall Freemasons.
Yes, and I do talk about fraternal orders in the book, and the fact that their white counterparts, of course, were discriminatory. So Prince Hall Lodge, Freemason Lodge, founded in the late 18th century. Certainly these were avenues of leadership for Black men within their own communities. Some of them had female auxiliaries. They do, in some cases, serve as benevolent or mutual aid societies, burial societies that help people out in times of need. And they're going to be another strategy for impoverished people to rely on each other. And again, this kind of bond of brothers within fraternal orders like the Prince Hall Masons, but also like the Odd Fellows and other groups.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to say we have books available for sale right outside, and for those of us joining online, I hope you will consider buying a copy through bookshop.org or Amazon or your online retailer of choice. So thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us.